Hello, tiny people. Time for another history lesson, this time about Bleeding Kansas. Now, this is an event that took place leading up to the Civil War. Again, this is the first time that blood was actually shed. It began as the whole slavery issue was as a political battle. Of course, it was based on economics. That's what slavery was really all about. But the partition started in politics. The person you're looking at is not, in fact, Andre Pasquini dressed up for church. It's a man by the name of Senator Stephen A. Douglas, a Democratic senator from the state of Illinois. And he very much wanted to be president. He had been working to gather a coalition of voters from across the nation for some years. Now, he was from the state of Illinois, so the Midwestern people loved him. That's called being a favorite son. It's easy to vote for someone who's very much like you. So people from a home state, from a home area, oftentimes vote for a candidate. So he was popular in the Midwest. Douglas was also very popular in the Northeast because as a senator, he had authored and sponsored a number of bills which helped the big business and the shipping industries in the North. What he needed was Southern votes in order to become president. And he was going to use that idea of popular sovereignty to gain support. Remember, popular sovereignty means the people in areas of the Louisiana Territory that become states will get to vote and choose whether they want to be free states or slave states. This is the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This is the method that Stephen Douglas used. He wrote this bill saying, or it was actually a number of bills saying, what we want is we want to let the people of Kansas, and right here is Kansas, over in it's a territory, it's a little larger than what the state is now. Nebraska is obviously much larger, but these two would come in next, and we're dealing with Kansas right now. As we look at the map, notice the light green territories. Those are not yet states, but they're ready to become states. Remember from the Compromise of 1850, Utah and New Mexico were granted territory status, and those are pro-slavery areas. The unorganized territory just north of Texas is what we call the Indian Nations. And if you remember, there are a lot of people in there who owned slaves. Yes, lots of Native Americans, a disproportionate number as opposed to the general population, were slave owners. Also, you had people like the Cherokee, not only as slave owners, but also people who despised the national government. They had been put on the Trail of Tears and had lost a huge percentage of the members of their tribe. So they have no love for the American national government. You look at the gold areas, those are the territories to come in next, starting with Kansas. The light green areas, those are the southern states, the states whose economy is based on slavery. And notice, please, along Chesapeake Bay, Maryland was a heavy slave state. It did not go south during the war, and we will talk about that, but they very much liked the idea of slavery. The light pink areas are states which have been admitted but are against expansion of slavery. Notice California is just in there from the Compromise of 1850. And of course, the darker pink areas, those are territories which lean towards free soil, not towards slavery. The idea of popular sovereignty would allow the people in Kansas, when it changed into a state, to take a vote and become whichever way that they chose, either pro-slavery or anti-slavery. Each group wanted to extend their influence. Look at the pro-slavery column. The people that were in Kansas that were pro-slavery were mostly border ruffians. That's what they were called. They came over the border from Missouri. They came over from Missouri and just went into the Kansas territory, and they wanted to get a quick vote and vote that Kansas would become a slave state. And they had no intention of staying and becoming Kansans. They wanted to go home to Missouri, which they did after having taken the vote, saying Kansas wanted to be pro-slavery and sending the paperwork into Washington saying, we have the border, we have the population, we have the Republican government, we've had our vote, let us in as a slave state. Look at the right-hand column. The people who actually wanted to live in Kansas were called free soilers. And the free soilers mostly came from New England. That was a long, arduous wagon trip all the way from the northeastern United States down to the Kansas territory. It took months. As a result, by the time the free soilers, the people who actually wanted to live and stay in Kansas, arrived there, the vote had already been taken by the border ruffians. So the free soilers, they took a new vote. Kansas ended up with two governments. The pro-slavery government was in a place called Shawnee Mills, capital Shawnee, Shawnee Mills, capital Mills. And the free soiler government was in Topeka, capital Topeka, the state capital today. Bleeding Kansas was a civil war, not the Civil War. By civil war, the definition there is simply a war between factions within an area, within a country. So when you talk about the Civil War, capital C, capital W, that's the fight that lasted from 1861 to 1865 between the northern states and the Confederacy, the southern states. This is not the Civil War. This is a civil war because there were factions within the country fighting. So this is lowercase c, lowercase w. These would be the border ruffians and the free soilers. The violence began when some of the border ruffians attacked the free soil town of Lawrence, Kansas. They came in, they burned some buildings, they damaged some properties, they shot off some guns, but they did not kill anybody. They did a lot of property damage. Now I get to introduce you to one of the interesting characters from American history, a man who some considered a saint, others considered the devil incarnate. He was a person who is often portrayed as being a loving person and holding a little black baby, and sometimes as a crazed man. He could, when he got worked up, have incredibly frightening eyes. His name was John Brown, and I think you'll see what I mean about the eyes. Oh, sorry. This is John Brown. John Brown was a radical abolitionist. John Brown wanted to get the war going because he felt a war was what was necessary to cleanse the country from the stain of slavery. It was the only way to free the people. And remember, an abolitionist is someone who is actively working to end slavery. Let's take a time out now. You can just pause this video. Go ahead, get a camera, get a phone, get a computer, and you need to take a John Brown selfie. Now, I expect those eyes to be wide, wide open. And then you send that to jim.homan@brookfieldacademy.org, where I will assemble a film for all of your enjoyment, featuring all of your beautiful faces with John Brown eyes. Now, lest you say, I can't do that. That's so uncool. Nobody would do that. I want you to know that I already have pictures of 12 or 14 of the faculty members with John Brown eyes. So I expect to be able to fill up the rest of the film with you guys. Send them along. Thank you. What actually happened, getting back to the serious business of Bleeding Kansas, was that John Brown, this radical abolitionist, took some of his sons and a number of his followers, and in retaliation for the raid on Lawrence, Kansas, these abolitionists attacked Pottawatomie Creek. It became known as the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre. This is another town in Kansas. And this time, instead of just damaging property, they killed a few people. The fighting broke out around Kansas then between the two groups. They each knew which was free soil area, which was border ruffian area, And they actually came to the point where there were large groups of armed men, sometimes numbering over 100, who would ride the countryside and attack each other's farms and towns and property, each other's herds. And a few of those groups even had small artillery pieces. That is, they had small cannon. It had reached such a point that the only way to restore order was for the United States Army to be sent in. And there's nothing that stops men with guns sooner than more men with bigger guns and more organization. So each side backed away, the violence settled down, but there's a really important lesson here. People were willing to die for the right to own slaves, and people were willing to die for the rights of those slaves to be free. The country was breaking apart. This is a very important idea because once violence started, it wouldn't take much longer to tip it all the way to full scale war between the sections of the country. And remember, the United States had become sectionalized. The northern part, they were against slavery and they were for the freeing the slaves and keeping the country together. The southern part, they were based on that agriculture economy. Unlike the North, who had industry, the Southerners, they wanted to keep their slaves, keep their way of life, and they were willing to go to war for it. Thank you, tiny people. I hope you took notes. Remember, next Thursday there will be a quiz. Hasta la vista, babies.